the world of Metabody, and he was also in Dresden in 2013 with us. We have been together promoting, so to speak, metahumanism, which is the manifesto actually is very much connected to the Metabody project and its roots. So we will do a double presentation. I will start now 10 minutes doing a brief introduction to the notion of metaphordances, and then Stefan is going to propose some other philosophical reflections, which actually connect, I think, in several ways to things we have been discussing today. Affordances is in some respects an attempt to expand the theories of affordances in many ways. In one, of course, it relates to challenging Gibson's idea that there's a direct perception of an already given world, and more in connection to inaction and other, the whole plethora of theories from cognitive science. Nowadays, it would point rather to a co-constitution of relations, so that it's not that the world is readily there waiting for us to be perceived, but how we perceive is a relational process of movement that also is constituted relations that actually constitute the world. So the world understood as an ecology of relations of movement that is shaping both how we perceive and the body itself. We understand, the world itself. If we understand the world in terms of relations of movement, rather than pre-existing entities. So one of the things I would like to challenge is the idea that objects exist. I don't believe in objects at all. I think that the idea of something as an object or as a form is the effect of particular alignments of perception, so which has a specific tradition as well. So particular kinds of aligning perception in very rigid apparatuses, like the ones I will show now, have focused our attention and our relation to the world in terms of dualistic separations, linear and circular alignments that make us believe in the existence of something as an object. And yet, the affordance, for example, of this bottle, well, it's clearly an effect of almost infinite relations of movement that bodies have done in relation to something that is not possibly totally definable. If we look at the whole history of what a bottle is, as an affordance, well, it has changed over time because of how bodies interact in changing manners. So affordance is interesting for me if we focus on the actual relations. So for me, the affordance is not the object, it's not just also the body that holds, but it's a potential of interaction, it's a movement. So the affordance for me is always in the in-between. Now, we have already heard some discourses about cognition being distributed. Fine, of course. Now, the issue that I would like to propose is it's not just a question of acknowledging the fact that any kind of cognition or relationality is a distributed process. But what kinds of distribution do we want to foreground? I mean, it's not the same to have a dictatorship, for example, is a kind of distributed cognitive process. Or even neoliberalism now is a kind of distributed cognitive process, a very complex one. Do we want these kinds of distribution, cognition and relationality, or do we want to propose different kinds of distribution, different kinds of ecologies? Metabody is about that. Metabody is about proposing other kinds of distributed cognition, other kinds of ecologies of relations. Now, I think that we live in an era where we have many levels of different kinds of what we could call imperial affordances, so ways in which perception has been structured according to how bodies were choreographed, forming metabodies such as empires and states. Empires and states have been metabodies that are the effect of alignments of bodies, of perceptions, right? So what kinds of technologies of perception have generated dualistic, circular, and linear alignments that make us think or believe that this is an object rather than a potential movement relation, for example, which is what I would like. So my idea is to shift Now, first of all, to understand these alignments that make us think that this is an object, and secondly, how can we shift the relation, how can we shift the movement so as to no longer see this as an object, but as a potential of relation which is much more open and diffuse. So metaphordance is a blurring of the affordance. It's a blurring of something which is very defined into something much more open-ended. So I always speak about this genealogy and researching still this history of perception from the birth of geometry, Renaissance perspective, mechanistic paradigms, ubiquitous cameras, and now with information, we don't have time now to go in detail into how complex this non-linear genealogy is, but still it's a genealogy of perception. It's a genealogy that has generated perceptual affordances that we embody. This relates to what Petra was talking about, these interfaces we have between the bodies. How are they working, these invisible interfaces? Well, they have a very long history. You know, Euclidean geometry, Platonic solids. This is a very important moment. We still live in the world of the Renaissance perspective of windows. All your little devices are still taking further the paradigm of visual hierarchy, visual alignment, and rationalization of vision that the perspective of window in the Renaissance enacted as a fundamental materialization of a dualism that later Descartes would solidify in a particular kind of philosophical discourse. But this was previously already enacting that dualism, the fundamental perceptual dualism. This is a machine for fixing vision. It's a particular affordance of perception. It's separating senses, which is questionable, first of all. It's fixing this dominant kind of perception, which is vision. It's rationalizing it. We still live in that. So this is an expansion of the same affordance, much more complex. So windows, many kinds of forms of militarization of perception, of making everything quantifiable, distancing us from the world. Many kinds of dualistic circular perceptions, this vision of God encompassing everything, cameras and satellites in our bodies everywhere, circularities, panopticons, radars. Greek theatre, that was one of the important moments leading to this, of course. This is what we have now. It's a similar, it's an expansion of a particular kind of way of capturing movement, capturing perception and movement in something traceable, in traceable patterns. So the intelligibility of something as an object, rather than an open-ended field of relations, has to do with that very, very strong linear alignment which we have embodied for millennia now. It's almost an epigenetic modulation. It is an epigenetic modulation in many respects, possibly also a genetic modulation. So how can we shift perception from this rigid alignment that makes us separate from something so that we only repeat certain very discrete choreographies and that reiterate the identity of the thing as a thing, as one just particular thing? How can we shift that perception so that it becomes a much more open-ended multiplicity of potentials? Well, this has to do with movement, with perception. We have to reinvent movement of perception away from that linear distance, the linear alignment, that fixity of the Renaissance perspective of movement, which is what metabody is basically about, from my perspective. So, metabody has a lot to do with what I would call non-functional design. I think for us to have a creative life, a creative ecology of relations, we need a lot of indeterminacy. Because if everything were already defined in its function, then what room is there for creativity in an ecology of relations? I think this point has been missed by a lot of design. So I think we need to re-engineer indeterminacy in our ecologies of perception, so that we, only when we are never quite sure what we are seeing, when we are open to different kinds of relations with our environment, only there, I think, there's room for some creativity. And I think life is full of creativity. We've just forgotten it. We are so aligned with a particular imperial tradition and imperial tradition of perceptual design. So there are different projects now in which I am doing the metabolic project and trying to deal with this. There's the METAFFORDANCES project, where we do this malleable wearable architectures. This is Lloyd Fuller. There's the Affordances project, which deals with digital architectures, which are always shifting so that it's always difficult to project form on them, so it's always challenging your attempt to fix them. Right? There's the microsectors project. Now this links to my colleague's presentation. Because the issue of questioning the form of bodies and objects and its identity has many potential resonances. For example, what happens when we want to challenge the way a body is fixed into categories of binary gender, binary sex, or sexuality? For example, how can we even challenge the idea of the anatomical reductionism of the body? So we tend to assume, because of course it's part of the cultural framework, that bodies are reducible to anatomies, and in sexual terms into genital anatomies and genital functions, reproductive functions. So there's a mechanistic worldview that is imposed on the body, which has to do with all those perceptual machines that see the body from outside, make a cartography of it, and then there's this mechanistic vision that reduces the body to a functional machine for reproduction. This, of course, has a historical context. We don't have time to go into that. The high point of that tradition is the Victorian era, which is the Industrial Revolution, where the forces, as Foucault has extensively analyzed, the forces of the bodies need to be channeled into the public, the factory. So we have inherited, we are heirs of the Victorian era, of this way of categorizing bodies and reducing them to functional choreographies of reproduction that relate to also an anatomical reduction of sex equaling genital choreographies. Now, this all relies upon a particular way of perceiving the body from an outside. This abstract perception, this Cartesian mind that looks from a distance through the perspectival window that we have interiorized, looks at the body from the outside and reduces it to a number of measurable components or anatomies. Well, in this project, microsectors, where I use micro cameras on the skin, which maybe tonight we can play with. The whole idea is to shift this whole perceptual apparatus using still vision, but in a very different way, in which there is no more this kind of perspectival distance, fixity, framing, so all these parameters of the tradition of visual domination, which was still embedded. They shift dramatically with no intention to fix or define another anatomy for the body than the one we know. It's what we call the post-anatomical body. How can we mobilize a body that is always attempting to exceed anatomical fixations rather than produce new anatomies instead of the ones we have? How can we produce a body that challenges its reduction to a binary genital distinction of man and woman, or binary sexualities? Well, these are experimentations that are being done. There are infinite ways of disaligning from these imperial machines of perception, just embedded. And we will hopefully be exploring many of those in the project. And this leads a bit into Stefan's part of the presentation, so if you want now to
Yes, thanks, Andy. So, yes, I will solely concentrate on one specific technology, which particularly this binary distinction of our means of reproduction is particularly strong, namely procreative technologies. So I will show how we can move away towards a plurality of bodily affordances from a traditional understanding of procreation. So thereby, starting off from the traditional Catholic perspective, which is the strongest in that field. So, from that perspective, it would be best if human beings die out, it seems. Because the highest love is the love of God, agape. And the strongest human beings are dedicated to this kind of love, the priests. However, the Catholic Church has realized that most human beings are not strong enough to live agape in its best manner, but cannot let go of their bodily desires. Consequently, marriage was introduced for the weaker human beings who cannot dedicate themselves to agape only. Marriage is a sole institution on the basis of which it's permissible to give in to one's desires. However, it's morally condemnable from a Catholic perspective if someone gives in to this strife solely for the sake of fun, because every bodily aspect has its own specific natural function. And immoral acts are acts in accordance with a specific goal our various bodily parts have. The telos, the goal of the sexual organs, is reproduction. Hence, reproduction needs to be the goal of every sexual intercourse. You may experience pleasure and express your love by having sex, but it's condemnable if you do not wish to reproduce yourself when having sex. I'm happy to say that we've moved away from this understanding of bodily affordances. In the new technologies and revised moral standards, in particular, the central recognition of the norm of negative freedom have increased the amount of procreative methods. We're no longer dependent on a man and woman from two different families who get married and make love in order to have offspring. Still, many means of procreation which represent practical possibilities are still legally forbidden in many countries, including Germany. To live and accept plurality and to move away from Catholic understanding of bodily affordances, many norms, rules, and laws still need to be altered. The examples: incest, hybridization, 3 biological parents, and selection after in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis reveal how concepts of the good embedded in legal institutions still infringe upon the autonomous decisions of adult parents concerning acts where no one gets harmed. I'll make some short comments upon each one of the above cases. Incest among adults is legal in Spain, but illegal in Germany. Recently, there was a case of a brother and sister in Germany who grew up separately, met as adults, fell in love, and had children together. The state threatens them to put the father into prison if they decide to have further children. The couple didn't obey, and the father was put into prison. They were merely two adults who were in love with each other and who wished to have a family. No one was harmed. Nevertheless, the concept of the good, which is part of a legal constitution, doesn't regard such a partnership as appropriate. A radically pluralist concept of the good acknowledges that such a partnership can be an appropriate one. Hybridization as an issue came up when scientists in the UK decided to make research with human-animal hybrids or para-humans. Between 2008 and 2011, more than 150 such embryos were created, but also had to be destroyed after a certain amount of time, it was 2 weeks. The question remains why it's necessary to destroy these embryos eventually. They do not represent a threat to human dignity, because the concept human clearly does not apply to them. In addition, by means of hybridization, the likelihood of our survival might eventually even be increased. The following research, undertaken by Dutch scientists, supports this suggestion. They altered zebra fishes genetically such that they are able to make photosynthesis and thereby gain part of their nutrition. The fishes turn slightly green as a consequence of this procedure. Zebra fishes and human beings are genetically not too different from one another. Given the population development and the issue of overpopulation, the question of our limited resources is an urgent one. Maybe such modifications or hybridizations will be one solution for this challenge, In addition, given the planned malnutrition, such procedures might be one way of solving the question of providing a sufficient amount of nourishment for future space missions. The little crew human beings known from science fiction literature might even represent the future of human species. The next topic, which reveals how strong our concepts of the good limit our procreative freedom, is that of threefold biological parenthood. In the US, a special type of infertility treatment called cytoplasmic transfer was legal for a certain amount of time, by means of which between 30 and 50 children were realized with 3 biological parents. That was more than 10 years ago. Now, a different method was developed by means of which the issue of 3 biological parents needs to be addressed anew. It concerns parents with specific mitochondrial diseases who wish to have biologically related children. Several techniques have been developed so that they can be realized. One option is to remove the nucleus from the cell with a defective mitochondria and then combine it with a healthy donor cell in which the original nucleus has been removed. In this case, there's an egg cell with the DNA from 2 mothers, as the nucleus contains DNA as well as the mitochondria from the cytoplasm of the other cell. This cell can get fertilized, whereby one could get a 3-parent child. This technique not only offers mothers with mitochondrial defects the possibility of having a biologically related child, but also lesbian couples or a partnership consisting of 2 women and 1 man, the possibility of having a biologically related child. So far, the technology has been applied successfully in the case of animals. In the case of humans, the egg cells have successfully been created but had to be destroyed for legal reasons. Consequently, there's been an intense debate in the UK whether such 3-parent babies should be permitted. I'm happy to say that the UK is the first country which has at least approved the use of this technology for medical purposes. Unfortunately, not yet for other purposes like for lesbian couples or 3 people who want to form a family together. The final procreative issue I wish to address here is that of selecting a fertilized egg after in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic variants. Technologically, this option is already given, yet there have been massive debates in various countries in how far these selecting procedures ought to be legitimate. The legitimacy of this procedure varies significantly from country to country. One of the central issues in this respect is that of the moral status of fertilized eggs, which varies significantly in the various states in the world. I personally think that it should be up to the parents to decide which moral status gets attributed to the fertilized eggs, as it's metaphysically unclear whether it has a special status or not. Furthermore, elsewhere I've shown in detail that selecting a fertilized egg after IVF and PGD is structurally analogous to selecting a partner for procreative purposes. And in the same way as the government ought to respect the procreative freedom of the citizens when they are choosing their procreative partners, they ought to do the same when the choice concerns fertilized eggs. By selecting a fertilized egg, you determine 100% of your child's gene. Yet by selecting the procreative partner, you also select 100% of your child's genes, as 50% of the genes come from yourself and the other 50% from your partner. Yet it also needs to be stressed that in both cases, your child is not selected entirely. By choosing your partner, you only choose a wide range of genetic possibilities of your child. By choosing a specific fertilized egg, you do not entirely determine the child either. Because due to epigenetic processes, the relationship between your child's genes and whether the gene is turned on or off gets influenced, which significantly alters the phenomenological qualities of your child. Hence, in both cases, a certain range of possibilities is determined, but this is not the case concerning the exact genetic makeup of your child. This argument shows why the right of procreative freedom should apply to both procedures in an analogous manner. Each one of the 4 topics concerning procreative options shows in which way a legally valid, stronger concept of the good can influence the choices of adults, even so no harm is done to anyone by using the technologies in question. People who wish to use the technologies get treated paternalistically in a violent manner and get hindered from realizing their deepest wishes and longings. It's highly questionable whether such regulations are in tune with the basic guidelines of a liberal democratic society. And hence I think a lot needs to be done in this respect in most countries in the world. Even though we've moved away from a Catholic understanding of procreation, there's still a long way to go to legally and morally accept that procreation can be realized by means of a great plurality of techniques.
I've been dealing with bioethics, with also perceptual ethics, which would be my topic in a way, so it's I'm also dealing with epigenetics and different kinds of any engineering we may do of our environment is an epigenetic modulation of ourselves. We only have time now to propose some of the many fundamental questions that can be raised when digging into these epigenetic modulations.
In those cases, I think it's this move away from rigid dualistic structures with a clear understanding of good and evil, where it's sort of where each bodily part has a specific function, where the bodily parts are categorized in dualistic manners, and now it shows this move away to its, a pluralistic understanding takes place. In the case now, bioethical, in a very specific issue concerning procreation, and in your part more into the visual perception.
And it also speaks about the need for a very pluralistic politics, which means at the same time as working on legal spheres and moral constructions and so on, also we need to work on how perception itself is being engineered. So, in fact, for me, it's always necessary to, I think politics nowadays still tends to reproduce rather narrow domain of ideology, so to speak. So just operating within kind of discursive politics, right, left, and so on and so forth. But we're almost never dealing with, how is it that neoliberal corporations are defining our perception, which is a fundamental place for politics nowadays. I believe that politics has shifted, not entirely, but mostly, to secret laboratories of corporations like Google, Apple, Facebook, and so forth, and also from the US and from states that are defining how we perceive when the iPhone is defined. And it's all totally protected by patents. It's a totally closed, it's far from being an open source kind of process. How perception is engineered through every single interface we use in information society. So there's absolutely, as far as I see, there's no intervention in how that happens. Of course, there are minoritarian movements, but I don't see yet movements that deal with all the formal aspects of the media, not just the content, but the whole perceptual architecture that is engineered through every interface. That is, for me, a major problem, which is yet very underestimated or not dealt with at all, in which hopefully in METAFFORDANCES we are trying to deal with some of us. So how is that happening? How is our perception engineered by Google and Facebook and Apple, with your little Apple computers and iPhones, which you are so proud of? Well, maybe we can debate on that. I don't know the other issues.
Well, I think that it's very interesting to see the tension here in something that has to do with their ethics of knowledge in relationship to perhaps a very full understanding of the complexities of being being a creature and all that. So one of the things that I feel that is really compelling, at least, but that very difficult sometimes to articulate, is how certain quite important models of understanding our lineages of thought, like science, for example, and biological thinking. I'm going to say we on purpose. We know that we are composite organisms. We know that we're using the word symbiosis because there was a woman called Weimar who took many years to actually make the symbiogenesis theory come to understand many different notions of wholes and composite and unity of this. Then the problem when we said we understand gender, it's like, of course, if we educate ourselves a little bit more, we understand how biology is fully queer and is fully, biology itself is, we talk about collectives and singularities all the time, encompassing a really, really beautiful, complex array of potentialities, if you use the same terms. But, I think that what I feel that is a concern is in the cultural representations that tend to be very simplified and still dichotomic, not necessarily all the time pushed by corporations. There have been histories of churches and a lot of oppressive movements, for a while. So I'm finding liberating very organismic understanding of queerness when we know that gender is defined in a very interesting continuum, and then the potentialities of three people panel. So just it's very liberating for me to see this, but of course legal apparatus seems like are falling behind, and popular understandings are falling in a way it's little hard to understand. But I don't think that it's just Google or, I understand the politics of neoliberal capitalism, that we're trapped, but there is perhaps more dimensions, dimensions that we're trying to understand.
Okay, if you have a quick response to that, let's take it, and we have to continue.
Well, I think in relation to biology, a major topic which is to be expanded in another vision is biologization. So, of course, in biology we have incredible discourses which I love, of the marvelous and the hyper-bacterial, hyper-sexual experimentations of which we come from. But biologization of the body, which is a long tradition from the 18th century, which studied, which gave birth to what some people have called dematerialized materialism, like Marx Sartre. So, how biologizing the body allowed it to be also quantified in very abstract terms. That's something we are in the middle of. And we have applications now. You can download applications to quantify your emotions, and the application will tell you, oh, you have to be friends with them, you have to become boyfriend with that one, and so on. So there's this whole management of your affects, which is increasing now. There's a whole economy of affects, what I call it affective capitalism. Also has to do with biologization processes, biometrics, which is an increasing, immense now. It's always based on reduction of the body to quantifiable patterns, and that relies on mechanistic analysis, ways of vision. It relies on fixed positions of quantification. So that whole process of reducing bodies and movements to quantifiable patterns is at the core of a biologistic kind of discourse, which is also at the core and is also underlying and supporting new modes of control in affective capitalism, where corporations offer you applications to manage your affective life through tracing your hours of sleep through your biometric device that you wear. So there's a very complex interrelation there between certain strong biopolitics and biologistic kinds of constructions, and the way neoliberal capitalism is pushing that into a completely new boundary, into a state racism now becoming corporate racism, and then you kind of almost eugenics, implicit eugenics.
And the important point, you pointed out, is still sort of how strongly traditional approaches, dualistic ways of understanding human beings are still embedded in particular in legal institutions. So basically the understanding of a human being consists in having an immaterial soul and a bodily sort of body corporeal parts. It is still part of many legal institutions in all parts of the world. I mean, in Germany, sort of, we've got the understanding the human being is a foundational concept of a foundational law, and it is still seen animals. I mean, are not identified with things. Animals, but with things. Sorry, animals are not identified with things or objects, but they are still treated under the object law, which means that there's still this, only human beings have this categorical special status, which is clearly goes back to the whole Christian and Kantian Platonic tradition. And so, even though most of us, I mean, we have moved beyond this understanding, and it's still strongly embedded in the legal system, and it shows many criticisms still need to be made.
Thank you. I would suggest maybe the other session of these questions at the end. Thank you very much.